All right. So I wanted to share some thoughts with you before we wrap up today, particularly for those of you that are getting ready for the July 2017 exam. Because one of the things that comes up at this stage is this dilemma of the difference between knowing and memorizing. And what's the difference and how does it work? And I've been trying to think about how I might explain it. Now, I know that most of you are not watching very much television, but I do like to watch television, particularly the sort of the retro old time stuff. And there's a brand new series on called Feud. And it's the fiction, well, not fictional, it is the actual story of Bette Davis and Joan Crawford as they were making the movie All About Eve. And it's a great acting, Jessica Lange and Susan Sarandon, Alfred Molina. It's really, really wonderful. And if you've got any interest in old time movies, it's a great show to be watching. It's done by the guy that produced Glee. And so it's just really cool. And for me, it's particularly interesting because some of you may or may not know this, but I grew up in a theatrical family. My mother was a stage actress and my father was a film director. And my parents were in the next generation after Joan Crawford and Bette Davis. However, my mother was a Bette Davis type of actress in her physical characteristics and her voice. And she did many of the same things that the original conflict pair, that's right. She did many of the same roles later in years later that Bette Davis did. So I was pretty interested in that, and I started watching, and it's great, and I encourage you, maybe you'll have to wait till after the bar exam, but in any event, check it out. It's a great series. But it got me thinking about this idea of knowing and memorizing, and I started to think back to the way that my mother worked as an actress and my father worked as a director. And what I meant and what I perceived by that was that a director generally knows the material. They know what they want to have happen. They plan it out, they set it up, they have a confidence in the material that they're using. An actor, on the other hand, memorizes their lines. They may not have any real idea of the overall impact of what's going on, particularly these days in film. But certainly, as a stage actor, you don't always know what the impact is of what you're doing. You're just out there memorizing your lines. Here are your lines. You memorize them. You recite them. It's the director that has the bigger picture of what's going on. Well, in the mid-1960s, my mother got a really good gig as an actress. There was an actor by the name of Paul Ford. He was a comedic actor. He'd been on a show called, with Phil Silvers, Sergeant Bilko, and it ran for years and it was very successful. And then Paul Ford had gone on to Broadway and done a Broadway comedy called Never Too Late. It's about a woman, maybe in her late 40s or early 50s, and she gets pregnant. And back then in the mid-1960s, that was pretty salacious stuff. In any event, it's a comedy, and Paul Ford is an older man who's got a relatively not young wife who gets pregnant. And what are they going to do? It's never too late. He does the Broadway show with Maureen O'Sullivan, sort of a later contemporary of Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, and then makes the movie Never Too Late also, and he does that with Maureen O'Hara. Then he realizes he's got this incredible product and he decides that he's going to go on tour around America doing Never Too Late. Well, neither of the Maureens want to do that with him, Maureen O'Sullivan or Maureen O'Hara. And they cast my mother in the Maureen O'Sullivan role. And so for years, my mother tours with Paul Ford as a co-star of the show Never Too Late. And it's really interesting because as a child growing up, I got to watch a lot of those performances, and I got to see my mother in this very funny role in which she's a very diminutive, small woman, or she was, with a very deep voice, very much like Bette Davis. Well, she had the actor's mentality about what was going on, but the directors always had a different view of what was happening. Now, that's a long way to set up what I really wanted to talk about. When we're talking about the bar exam, there's a difference between knowing and memorizing. And one of the challenges that bar takers get into is that they get confused between these two concepts. there are certain things that you need to know, and then there are certain tools that you have to have. But memorizing is not one of the things that you want to do. In other words, you don't want to be the actor, you want to be the director. And I thought I could just sort of describe that for you by using a little bit of what I viewed with my mom as an actress traveling for all these years. When you're taking the bar exam, one of the things that you need to know is what skill is being tested. What do the examiners want from you? There's a different skill on a performance test than on an essay, than on the multiple choice test. And if you deliver the wrong skill, it's not going to work for you. Well, one of the things that my mother learned very early on was that the star of the show was Paul Ford. That's who people came to see. That's who they wanted to see. And it was not her. She was a character actress. She was not Maureen O'Sullivan. She was not Maureen O'Hara. She was not Betty Davis. And so she had to understand that her job as an actress was to set up his laugh lines. She had to literally give him the room to make the jokes and to do the things that people came to see. She had to understand that within her memorized lines, she had a task, and the directors were very clear with her that she had to give him room. So one of the things that I recall is that in the play, there's a certain point at which she tells her husband that she's pregnant, and his line is, "You're what?" That's the line, "You're what?" But the way that he does this is he stretches out "you're what" into, and I'm not exaggerating, 5 minutes of "you're what." He just keeps saying, "You're what? You're what?" And he goes on, and he was a great comedian, and he could do amazing things, and the audience is cracking up, and she has to hold character and stay in it during that entire process in which he's literally milking 2 words, "You're what?" Okay. Now, her job is just to set him up. That's what she needed to know. She had to understand the skill that she was supposed to produce. Now, she was a very talented actress. She could do drama. She could do comedy. She could do a lot of things. But for that role, every night, she just knew she was going to be there for as long as he wanted to milk the audience. And he would play games about how long and how he'd stretch out the words and what he'd do. So she had to be really aware of what was going on. Did she know her lines? Had she memorized them? Absolutely. It didn't matter, though. It was knowing what to do with the line. It was understanding how it fit into the bigger context that made a difference. In the same way, when you're studying for the bar, you need to figure out what's the most important part of this particular part of the exam and how do I demonstrate that skill. So if we're talking about an essay, the most important part is not the result. It's the reasoning that you use. It's how you get from step A to B to C. It's showing the reasoning and the logic and the structure. If you're doing that, then you're giving the examiners what they want. By the same token, when we're talking about a multi-state question, it's really not at all about the reasoning. It's about the result. You can't say, well, I choose the answer B, and here's my paragraph explaining why. The examiners don't care. No one cares how you got there. It's just the result. And so you've got to know what skill is being tested. On a performance test, it's certainly not knowing the law because there is no law to know. Okay, it's just right there. It's how do you use it. And so I think the first thing that you've got to understand is what skill is being tested and then work towards that skill. Put your ego aside. You don't have to show everything that you know. You don't have to prove that you're the star. You just have to do your job on that part of the exam. Okay, so that's the first skill that I think you've got to know. The first thing you need to know, what skill is being tested. The second thing you need to know is how to use the law. How to use the law. You know, when you think about what a lawyer does in practice, I think it's a lot like good improv. When I watched my mom do this show, even though she and Paul Ford did literally, I don't know, I want to say maybe 400 or 500 performances, and I might be undercutting that because they did this show for nearly a decade. So probably more than that. Every night was different because he was an improv artist. He just went off. And she never knew, or at least she said, she never knew what he was going to do in any particular part of the show. Sometimes he would skip whole pages of the script. The older he got, the more of the script he skipped, apparently. But he would improv, and he would go back and pick up things later in the show and pick up lines later in the show. And her job, it was basically a 2-person show. So she had to literally react to what he was doing. Now, if she had only memorized her lines and she could only work in this rigid fashion, when he started jumping around the script and going with laugh lines and taking on all of these different personas during the show, it would have been nearly impossible for her to be able to get through each night. So she had to be good at improv. She had to react to what was happening. I think that's a skill that a good lawyer has. You have to react to what's going on around you. You may have prepped out for trial or litigation or deposition, but then something unusual happens and you've got to be able to react. Now, the reason that that's important for the bar exam is that the examiners know that that skill is really important. And therefore, if you are rigid in what you're doing, if you say, look, I'm going to tell you all of these 10 things, only 2 of which actually matter, what you're really demonstrating is a total lack of improvisation, a total lack of how to use the law. You're just saying, I can memorize and recite it. If you're in that mindset of just memorizing and reciting rather than knowing, then you're not really taking advantage of the full set of tools that are available to you. And let's face it, when lawyers are most excited is when they get to improvise and they get to use what they know and make something happen. And so one of the reasons the bar exam is so frustrating to people is that they can't connect this idea of I'm rigidly memorizing versus what I'm going to do in practice. I just read an article from a student, a 2L at Hastings, who's the chair of the Student ABA Association in California, talking about why the California bar exam is so unfair and the scores are so high. And he makes a lot of really great points. But then near the end, he says, and so the problem is that the bar examiners are asking us to memorize and recite the law. Well, he's right and wrong. He's right that that would be a problem, but he's wrong that that's what the examiners are doing. They're not rewarding that behavior at all. And unfortunately, as a 2L, he's bought in, I think, to this notion that the way you pass and study for the bar is you memorize and recite. And he correctly notes that that's not what he thinks lawyers are going to do. He's right about that. But it's not what the examiners are doing in California or anywhere else. So don't get caught up in that. Make sure that you know how to use the law. All right, the third thing that I think you need to know is what you're good at doing and then do more of that. Find out what you're good at doing when it comes to the bar exam and then do more of that. Now, here's the analog for me. As I said, my mother was this tiny woman, blonde-headed, blue-eyed woman. I don't know. But she had this incredibly deep voice, and it was very, very funny because you never expected this big, deep voice from this little tiny person. Well, she learned early on as an actress that she could milk that just for everything. And so here's this sweet little lady. I mean, you can sort of think Edith Bunker, if that helps a little bit, with big, deep voice. And she would play it to maximum effect in this show and in many others. She learned that that was a particular skill because it was so unexpected, and she managed to use it. And she used that over and over again. Now, when you're in the bar and you're studying for the bar, you're going to discover that there are things that you're good at. You're good at making arguments. You're good at reasoning. You're good at analyzing. You're good at intuitively figuring out what the result should be. One of the things you want to be doing right now is to discover what things you're good at and do more of those. That's the success-based approach to learning. The inverse of that, as many of you have heard me say, is the problem-based approach to learning. What aren't you good at? Let's focus on all the things you're not good at. My mother could not sing. Couldn't sing. So she didn't try out for musicals. Makes sense to me. She was not good at, certain kinds of roles. So she didn't do them. She understood that she was typecast as the next generation Betty Davis. She did Betty Davis roles. You get the idea. You follow the things you're good at and you do more of those things and you avoid the things you're not good at. Now, I'm not saying that you ignore your writing skills or deficiencies that you've got in one part of the study, but you don't spend a disproportionate amount of time working on those instead of the things you should be working on. All right. Well, what kind of tools will help you with this knowing and memorizing? There are a couple of things that we've built into the course that I think are really important. One of them is this notion of spaced repetition. Spaced repetition simply means that you learn a small body of material, then you put it aside for a short period of time. You come back to it and repeat some of that material and then add a little bit of new material to it and then set it aside for some time and then come back and add some new material to that and repeat and rinse and repeat. And you keep doing that. That idea of spaced or stepped repetition is an amazing tool to help you know rather than to memorize. It's a great tool to use to help you overcome some of the challenges. One of the things I didn't tell you about my mother as an actress is that she had amazingly enormous, overwhelming, unbelievable stage fright. Every single performance, every play, her entire career, she refused to go on stage. It was crazy. I mean, it went for years and years and years and years. My mother would go through this enormous stage fright. And in fact, she would give herself laryngitis because she was so nervous every performance, even though she'd done it hundreds of times. How did they resolve that? Well, the directors, finding the tool to help, actually in Never Too Late, redid the opening of the show so that her first entrance onto the stage literally is the stage manager off stage shoves her onto the stage so that she stumbles. And that's her entrance through the door. She stumbles in. It's a laugh line. It was not the way the play was written, not the way the movie was done, but it's funny. And what they did is once they got her on stage, there was no more stage fright. She was fine. She was a terrific actress, but they couldn't get her on stage. So they literally had to shove her on stage. Well, look, for some of you, that's exactly what has to happen. You have to shove yourself on stage. You have to kind of get that, that tool that will get you out there and get you going. Spaced repetition works that way because it's just a small chunk of material, and then you can add more material to it, and then more material, and then more material. So that's one of the things I think that's so very important, is that you be able to work and modify and get yourself into the game, get yourself on stage. And then the last tool I want to talk about, and I'll wrap up after that, is that you have to trust. You got to trust what you're doing. You got to trust the process. You got to trust the course that you're in. If you don't trust those things, you're in real trouble. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Whether you're in our course or somebody else's, you're just in trouble if you don't trust. You know, my mom told me that one of the things that made her crazy about working with Paul Ford was that she never knew what he was going to do. Never, ever. After all those years, she never knew. But then she finished by saying, but I trusted him. I trusted him as an actor, as a colleague. I trusted him in improv. And I've talked to people that are great improv comedians, and they say the first rule of improv is you got to trust. You never say no, and you trust. You see, you got to trust in order to make it work. You got to hold the next line. You got to make the adjustment. You got to do the things that are required to be successful. If you don't trust what you're doing, if you don't trust the instruction you're getting, if you don't trust the approach that you're using, I promise you none of this will work. It just won't work. Where I see people having success is when they buy in, when they trust, and then they build on that. And they come to find that they have enormous skills and abilities. Now, I don't know if you're going to become the next Betty Davis or Joan Crawford or just a good working actress like my mom, but I do believe that you can pass the bar, and I believe you can be successful in your studies by just taking advantage of what you know, using that, and then trusting and using the skills and the tools that will make it come together for you. And if you do that, I think you're going to have great success.